on my attention. My countrymen, they love their fiction. Words upon now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the independent politics and media podcast, where we are rapidly approaching 100 episodes of season 2. We have current events. In a couple of weeks, we're going to go on current events hiatus. We'll continue releasing content as it comes to us, but just keep an eye out for a little gap in recordings and publishing at that point. Today, we are only focusing on a couple of issues because there are some big, horrible things happening in the world. Nothing has changed in that regard, but we do have a little more expertise on hand to dive in a little deeper on the current stuff. I'm joined by my co-hosts. Welcome, Simon. How are you doing?
I'm enjoying your radio voice, Kyle. I'm enjoying that. Yeah, welcome to 1 of 200. You've refined it, I think, a little bit.
Look, over 5 years, you'd fucking hope so.
and yet somehow, actually, no, your audio is a lot better than it was several weeks ago. So, sometimes there are silver linings.
Look, fuck you. And also joined by Ginny. How are you doing, Ginny?
Hi, yeah, I'm surviving. I've had like a week full of media conferences, so my brain is like melting out of my skull. But
That's
apart
exactly
from
what
that,
we want.
pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah. And look, that's the energy we want to bring to this podcast. So glad to have you here. We're also joined by friend of the cast, Jeremy Moses. Fantastic to have you back. How are you? And for people who haven't heard from you previously, can you just give us a little intro? Let us know where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. Kia ora koutou. Thanks for inviting me back on again, Kyle. I'm Jeremy Moses. I'm an associate professor at the University of Canterbury in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here again, but obviously pleasure is a difficult word to use at this time in history. It's a beautiful day here in Christchurch. It's been quite a beautiful week and quite a beautiful few weeks. But yeah, this past week I taught 6 hours on Gaza to 2 different classes, to my second year class and my master's class. And wow, yeah, just going over this stuff and I mean, in a sense, it's a privilege to be able to pass this stuff on to students, to give them information that they do not otherwise receive if they don't dig into the reality of what's taking place in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank. So yeah, on the one hand, it's an honor to be able to do that work, but yeah, it's hard as well. Like, it takes a toll.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with us today. I think just like before we get into the current events, I wanted to ask you a bit around, the teaching around Gaza and the opportunity to just like at a baseline inform people about it who might not have encountered it, even despite, everything happening in the world. It can be really difficult to get your hands on that information as a layperson. We had an article from Kieran Kelly a couple of weeks back where he talked about the bifurcation of information systems in terms of receiving detail about what's happening in occupied Palestine and with the genocide, and the way in which, if you're an activist, if you're plugged into these, you are seeing a level of horror beyond what your casual observer might be seeing. And it means our realities are diverging at this monstrous rate. How are you finding that dissonance, teaching from the podium as a lecturer to students who are like just joining the field of international relations or politics?
Yeah, it's interesting because you, in a lot of ways, and this isn't just limited to this subject, but I guess all teaching at tertiary level, when you're immersed in things, your own research areas, or even areas where it's, the introductory material on, international relations theories and things like that, over time you come to think that it seems very basic and obvious, like that the concepts are really basic and obvious. And I think a lot of the time they are, that people have this kind of aversion to thinking theoretically about the world or to getting into topics. But actually, once you do spend some time with things, you realize that they are quite obvious and quite basic. And I think we're very much still in that phase now, despite the fact that, it's been clear that there's this genocide going on since the end of last year. To anyone who has taken some time to look at what's been taking place, but that still hasn't really washed through to the general public or even to students of international relations who are interested. They're genuinely interested. They're generally worried. My sense is that they have some ideas about where they stand in relation to this issue. I think there's some people who obviously have objected to my teaching on this, but it's only like one person, in fact, who's made this complaint about the initial lecture that I gave on it. But the remainder of the students are extremely appreciative and open to learning about what's going on. In terms of then, in the context of 1 or 2 hours, or, yesterday I was lucky enough to have 3 hours with a master's class to talk about this stuff. I always think some kind of visual stuff is necessary, documentary. I don't know if you've seen the Al Jazeera documentary, The Night Won't End. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this. It's painful to watch. Like, it's really grueling to go through. It's about 1 hour and 20 minutes. It goes through 3 or 4 different cases, including the Hind Rajab killing, the killing of Hind and her family in really extreme detail. Interviews with her mother, with family members. They reconstruct what happened to the car that Hind was in with her uncle and auntie and cousin. They have the audio of the conversation that was had with the Red Crescent and speak to the people who were on those phone calls. They reconstruct what happened with Forensic Architecture and Earshot. So these 2 NGOs that do investigative work on war crimes. And really, you can't come out of watching that documentary without understanding that this is a genocide that's taking place.
Yeah.
It's impossible. Like, I even think if someone went into that thinking like, Hamas is evil terrorists, all the people in Gaza deserve what's happening to them, I don't believe you could come out after that and maintain that case. So there are ways, I think, of cutting through quite quickly. And once you establish that as the baseline, that there is this really extreme, malicious violence that is taking place against civilians, where it's not just in the case of Hind Rajab, there are thousands of similar cases where people are being rounded up in their apartment buildings and gunned down and beaten, and, as we saw yesterday, thrown off rooftops. It's really and no evidence whatsoever that any of these people are actually involved in fighting or associated with Hamas in any kind of way.
Yeah, we'll get to that particular point soon as well, I imagine.
Yeah, so once you can cut through that, because that still remains the narrative in our media, that oh, well, I heard Corinne Dan on interviewing Winston Peters the other morning. Oh, why has New Zealand gone against our Five Eyes partners on this General Assembly resolution? It's like, are we still here? Like, really? Are we still here? Like, someone who's supposed to be closely observing what's taking place,
Look,
and is still, whether out of fear of being
yeah,
harassed by the Israel Institute or by the Jewish Council or the Holocaust Center, I'm not going to criticize. I'm going to, take this side of it. It's bizarre to me, really bizarre.
like, imagine being as a radio broadcaster to the right of Winston Peters on international politics. Like, that's just
right.
an absolutely absurd space to be in. One thing I wanted to touch on, I guess, just in terms of the framework around the rest of the conversation, and some of the things that have been happening in the media and, I guess, social media space on this is, you mentioned The Night Won't End documentary, and just a level of time and production that needed to go into that to create this record, to help people understand and to kind of have an historical piece of media to get this message across, compared to those very quickly 3D rendered Hamas has a relay center under the hospital kind of stuff that Israel throws out every other day. And somehow, as far as leadership and media go, those two things are equivalent. And as a result, the I was going to say organic social media environment, but there's so much inorganic and inauthentic engagement in there as well. It means there are a whole bunch of actors out there, and you might call it Hasbro staff or whatever, like paid and organized operatives doing this work who can act in incredibly bad faith about what they're saying, and to kind of touch on, maybe the way some of your students approach it, who are trying to approach it in good faith, taking advantage of the lack of information and the good faith approach of people who just want to know more. And who don't want to jump too quickly to say things like, oh, it's a very complex situation. Whereas, as you pointed out, it's actually quite simple at its basic tenets. But people are willing to take that step back and not, overplay their support for Palestine, or their, say they're completely anti-genocide, or get into the politics of, Israel's right to self-defense, in air quotes. Because they are trying to be genuine in the way that they engage with those issues. And I think we're still in that period where that bad faith attack or strategy is far more powerful than it should be, propped up by Western media organizations, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, at the end of the class yesterday, one of the students said, so what is our responsibility, like in terms of approaching this issue as students? And I said, approach it as you would any other issue. Like, there's no reason to treat this as some kind of special case. I've taught about, I've criticized Russia, I've criticized China, I've criticized Saudi Arabia, I've criticized Australia, New Zealand, the United States over my career.
Yeah.
Like, I do that frequently. I do it every year in my courses, because they all do terrible things at different times, and they deserve to be called out for the terrible things that they do. So the idea that, oh, no, in this case we can't actually talk about it, or we have to approach it in a particular special way, is just wrong. So it's just like, for a student, if you're interested in researching it, if you're interested in writing about it or speaking to your friends and family about it, do so as you would for any other case. Like, don't be afraid of this. I understand that this system is powerful, like, and it has been built for a long time, and now I've experienced it myself. I understand it. It's stressful, it's difficult, but it's also farcical. It should be treated as a joke. And I believe over time it will be looked back on as quite a joke, quite shocking that people took this kind of propaganda system seriously and were so afraid of it, and that it was upheld like so sincerely by our media and political leaders. It really is farcical. And I think now we're at a stage where we can be free to say that, and we should feel very free to say that and affirm that, and that the people associated with it should feel humiliated and should feel embarrassed about what they're doing. And we're not there yet, but that's the direction that we need to be heading in.
Where do you think the inflection points are for that beginning to happen? I guess just in light of, New Zealand voting against its Five Eyes partners on recognition. Oh, no, not recognition. On, God, it just went out of my head on what the vote was exactly.
I was saying the settlements should be
right,
within 12 months in accordance with the ICJ advisory opinion. Yeah.
There's clearly movement happening there, but, just in terms of the recent attacks in Lebanon, as far as I know, the government still hasn't made a statement about that. There's still very little being said openly, votes aside, and that's good. Like, I'm glad that we're voting as a country on the right side of history to some extent, but you don't have our foreign minister or our prime minister or our deputy prime ministers directly and openly talking about what's happening in the West Bank, let alone what's happening in Gaza. Where do you think that shift is likely to happen at a domestic level in New Zealand, but that applies across the Western world as well? And we might not believe the US or the UK are going to flip on that, but surely things have to shift at some point.
Yeah, you would think so. And in fact, the New Zealand government not only hasn't made a statement about the attacks on Lebanon, a critical statement as far as I'm aware, but the day after they took place, there was this joint statement released, a US statement, but with the GCSB's insignia on it and the other Five Eyes countries, about China. compromised devices part of China-linked botnet found in
It's
New Zealand.
embarrassing.
It's like, are you people serious? Like is this an attempt to distract from what happened yesterday? Or was this, if this was planned, would you not reconsider releasing this statement about compromised devices and botnets? It's like,
As
how do we take
historic
this
as well,
seriously?
right?
Yeah,
Like, it's
very
really
weird.
hard to stomach.
Yeah, but in terms of inflection points, I don't know. I mean, I've been saying to more and more people recently that if you're worried about the use of nuclear weapons, I would say that the state most likely to use nuclear weapons at some point in the future will be Israel, because they don't recognize any limits to under international law or international norms. I believe that they are in an ideological and political moment in which there are people within that government that would think that is something that they're entitled to do and that is reasonable to do against Iran, perhaps. Maybe that would be an inflection point. I would like to think an ICC, the actual issuing of arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant would perhaps be that as well. Like,
Yeah.
at that point, can we agree that there's a problem here? Who knows how long the ICJ case will take with South Africa's case? So that's years away, I think.
Yeah, and it's too late.
Potentially what could happen in the years before that they make a decision, there's likely to be other points before that happens that I think people would have to just acknowledge that this is a state that's just completely out of control.
Yeah, and I think like there's a sense, I have to believe that even leadership that is currently all in with Israel, or avoiding the question, as happens more often in New Zealand, they know. Like, all of these people know. All the people doing these weird, like, horrid little arguments around Israel's self-defense, or like, oh, everything's Hamas or everything's Hezbollah. They must know, at this point. They know, and they're doing it anyway, is the only rational way to consider, which makes them monsters. I want to be very clear. It's anyone who's still unsure about it, is more likely to be in the general public, and just have like bad information. But I think that's becoming less and less likely as well, except if you're engaging with it willingly. So I just won't listen to anything from actually, and I don't even know how that would be the case at this point, considering even Israeli media is being quite open about this stuff.
I think there's a few things. I think that there is still that pervasive sense of fear, of not wanting to be singled out and not wanting to be harassed. But I hope that people are realizing that that's not something they should worry about anymore. I think the other important thing is that that racism still plays an incredibly important part here. Like, people genuinely have internalized decades, particularly the last 2 decades, but it goes beyond September 11 as well. It goes back further than that, of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiment, association of Muslims and Arabs with terrorism. 2019, March 15, 2019, and the response to that represented a small blip at which I think people were like, oh, wow, they actually are humans too. But we've seen that that's just completely faded away over the years since then. And a lot of people, political leaders, media, I think, are very willing to still accept the narrative of all Muslims and all Arabs are terrorists. So they're happy to go along with it from that point of view. So I don't necessarily think that they see Israel's actions as evil if you're coming at it from that point of view. Yeah, and then there's the low information people as the kind of third category, and even if they don't have that deep sense of racism within them, then they just might go along with what they hear on the radio, and what they hear on the radio is
nothing,
not telling what's happening.
Yeah, just more and more. I still, it's not something I'm ever going to understand unless someone gets outed at some point, or there is like a high level leak of why this hasn't been covered.
There's a great tweet I saw yesterday in response to another one, and someone wrote, "Very cool to learn that they didn't need to hide the reality of the camps in World War II. by suddenly learning you are surrounded by people who would not have cared about the reality of the camps. And I think that really, that's where we are. I think that's really interesting because we grow up thinking, oh, how did the Germans go along with this? Why didn't people react more quickly to the Holocaust, to the extermination of people, rounding up and killing of people in this way? And now we can say, well, this is how.
Yeah, we
This
had
is
a
how, yeah, it's happening now.
we had an audio clip from Kieran Kelly as well, and one of the points he made was fascist systems, fascist politicians, political parties, fascistic media narratives over time create fascist populations, and those populations are just more willing to go along with this stuff.
Yeah.
And in Israel, that's a significant percentage, but that doesn't preclude other Western countries from having a group of people like that as well.
Yeah, I was lucky enough last night to go and see a film Aprile by Nanni Moretti. He's an Italian director. He's socialist himself, made many great films over the years. This one's from 1994. It was part of the Italian Film Festival that's on here at the moment, and it's always been one of my favorite films, but I've never seen it at the cinema before. And it kind of depicts, it's autobiographical, but it's set in the 1990s as initially as Berlusconi is rising to power in Italy. And they're talking about Berlusconi and his politics and his party as a fascist party. And, the horror of this taking place in Italy at that time. And then it goes through the later years in the 90s where the left parties actually come to power, but they don't actually live up to their promise. And there's this Albanian refugees being sunk and dying en masse, and he's trying to sort of grapple with this alongside his own life. It's a really fascinating movie. I really recommend it. But what interested me about it was there's a lot of clips of Berlusconi talking at that time. And the language is actually kind of indistinguishable from Christopher Luxon or any kind of centre right or centre left party. Frankly, Labor government in Australia, like the way in which he's talking about Italian society and we want an Italy that works rather than an Italy that talks. It's this kind of rhetoric, which was called fascism in Italy at that time in the early 1990s, has become completely normalized around the world since then. So, yeah, it's quite interesting to see how that's happened.
As for the Israeli population itself, it's self-selecting because the project of planting a settler colony within the Middle East required people to be fascists, even if they didn't realize it, whether they were red, brown, the kibbutz working, labor Israelites, or whether they were, other people who were much more openly fascistic. But in either case, the ideology of Zionism requires that. And it requires a racial superiority. And therefore, I think there's not much of a point in discussing, what resistance can come from the Israeli left about this. This really is the responsibility of the West, because that population is not going to do anything because they agree entirely with it. And I think that palming it off to particular leaders as the more squeamish and craven politicians in the United States, such as Bernie Sanders, have done, this is Netanyahu's war, et cetera, is a way of deflecting from the project of what Israel itself is, and from the responsibility that its existence is predicated upon the large asset the West grants it. And therefore, the withdrawal of that consent could end the genocide in days. And that it is incumbent upon us and those who live in the United States and the other constellation of countries that calls itself the West, for whom this genocide is really useful, to attempt to stop it. And I think that that's the discussion. Thinking about the racial politics of it, Jeremy, that there are people who see somebody who is Arab, Muslim, ignoring the fact that there are Palestinian Christians and so on and so forth. Just that sort of idea of this block of people who are amorphous, brown people who live in this vague region of the world. We don't really know, but we know that, they had our way of life. They had us for our freedom. That sort of Bush kind of gloss on the world. That I think it's interesting to note and recall what Edward Said said, that Zionists introduced terrorism to the Middle East. They were the ones who in the 1920s pioneered undertaking market bombs, of terrorizing the populations to cleanse the villages, to kick Palestinians out of where they lived and to make them flee and be refugees within their own lands, before even the Nakba. And then the Nakba is the great cleansing that happened, the great sort of initial kickoff to the genocide, in which that happened en masse. How do people get to Gaza from the villages that they used to live, in the north or in the east? Well, it was through the Nakba, right? That they were corralled into that really small area of Israel. And that was done through terrorizing the civilian population. And that was with the backing of Western powers and with the tacit approval of them, even though Israel didn't fully gain US backing until the 70s. But I think it's crucial to understand that even though that layer is impressed upon it, even the impression of using these data points of what is Islamic terrorism that does exist, all of these were reactions to pan-Arab socialism, to the deposing of leaders like Mossadegh, to getting rid of any idea of pan-Arab solidarity in the attempt to have a kind of socialist solution and the self-government in the mold of what was happening in Cuba, for example. And the United States and Britain, and tacitly New Zealand and other countries, approving the overthrowing of these leaders and these parties and the installation of hard right-wing, extremist, conservative, reactionary regimes in those countries, was what sprang up many of these organizations. I mean, Al-Qaeda famously started as the Mujahideen, and ISIS is also one which has benefited greatly from tacit back channeling support. And in fact, Israel, has supported ISIS in the past through taking its soldiers into its hospitals and healing them and sending them back out as a means of sowing chaos. And so if we want to think about where that sort of perception of terrorism comes from that justifies this racialized lens through which children, not even, let's forget children because I think they're too easy and uncomplicated moral subject, people, just ordinary Lebanese people being attacked en masse in what sets a horrific precedent through these exploding pages, bombs on people's hips and so on. That lens in itself doesn't make sense from two angles. The first being that Zionists, the ones who introduced terrorism into the Middle East, Syed notes, and the second being that these data points of Islamic terrorists about whom so much hay was made in the 2000s and the 2010s and sort of justified the Obama era massive tech surveillance panopticon that was created, that was then immediately gifted to Trump as the next philosopher king. All of these were justified by these reactionary groups, which were originally seeded and funded by the United States to prevent communism from taking root within the so-called Arab states. And I think it's worth considering that when we think about that kind of lens and where those prejudices come from and what interests they serve, even setting apart the idea that, these particular people in the world, these brown people, their lives don't matter. They're just kind of worthless to us. They're like bugs on the windshield to be wiped off. Even setting that aside, where it comes from is quite important for people to understand, because you might take off the ideological blinders by saying, oh no, children had their faces hurt and people were losing eyes in Lebanon and these terrible maimings were going on. But it's another thing to really peel back all of those ideological layers and really understand what's going on with these war crimes.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think that there obviously is the Cold War history that feeds into the politics of the broader region. I'm a bit wary though, like of some, with someone like Gaddafi, for example, who comes to power as a young, idealistic revolutionary, committed to socialist principles, but it really imposes an incredibly vicious internal surveillance and oppression regime on his own people as his time in power progresses, and we see that across other countries as well. Now we can obviously talk about why those leaders felt compelled to do that within their own countries and against their own populations, and what sort of outside interference from the US and other actors, leads to the need to control populations in that way, or to control the allegiance of your population in that sort of violent and repressive way. But yeah, no doubt, the geopolitics, the ideological politics, the economic politics of of the 20th century creates the situation that we're left with today. And I think, the whole question of terrorism is really central to that, whether it's in relation to Gaza or in relation to Lebanon, as you say. Another one of the questions a student asked yesterday after watching that excerpt on Hind Rajab from The Night Won't End is like, what's the strategy? And there was an article, I think, as well, it was in the New York Times or Washington Post. It's like, impressive attack against Hezbollah, but what's the biggest questions about what the strategy is? And it's like, it's obvious what the strategy is here. Like, there's no issue of strategy here. The strategy is one of terrorism, like terrorizing people, either killing them directly or causing them to believe that they have no choice but to flee in order to protect their lives and the lives of their families. So to leave the land. So terrorism, dispossession, genocide, apartheid, all of these things are related in that sense. This is the strategy. You don't send a tank in and start shooting at civilians who are fleeing from a conflict, a 15-year-old girl and a 6-year-old girl in the back of a car that has already been hit by a tank shell, and then fire several rounds of machine gun fire into those children in the back of the car from a few meters away. And then when an ambulance is called to try and save the last living person in that car, the 6-year-old girl, Hind Rajab, and it's approved hours later by the Israeli military. They say, yep, the ambulance can come and pick up the child. The ambulance arrives and is hit by a tank shell, and the 2 ambulance drivers are killed. The ambulance is completely, they couldn't even find the body of one of the ambulance drivers after that attack. The strategy is one of terrorism. The strategy is one of creating such intense fear in the population about the madness of what they're facing, like the sheer madness and limitless violence of what they're facing, that they feel like they have no option but to leave that land. So yeah, I agree on that point, like that there is that strategic element for Lebanon. Yeah, we'll see how that develops. I mean, Israel's attacked Lebanon on several occasions over the years, 1980s, 2006. My dad's family's Lebanese. They are Maronite Christians, so they have allied themselves with Israel in the past, including in carrying out the Sabra and Shatila massacres in 1982. I don't think any of my immediate relatives are involved in that. And I'm not saying that all Christian Maronites are evil, and I'm not saying all of them are allied with Israel either, because that's simply not the case. But the broader political orientation of that group of Christians in Lebanon has been towards Israel, and I was discussing this with Kyle just before we started, that we see some of them being pushed forward as spokespeople to say, yeah, it'd be great to have Israel come in and wipe out Hezbollah, and then we'll all live happily ever after. They don't understand that they will be terrorized and dispossessed along with everybody else in Lebanon as soon as it's possible and convenient to do so. So that broader orientation towards terrorism, dispossession, genocide, that has to be understood. Yeah, and the West's backing of that has to be understood. I've also been very clear with the students that this should give us pause to reflect on our own history. Like, I grew up in Australia, so Australian history, Aotearoa history, where similar things happened. This is how these states were established. And if we want to observe it now and be critical of it now, we have to think, this was the experience of First Nations people in Australia. This was the experience of Māori in Aotearoa, of having this malevolent violence arrive in their land, and then having to figure out how to deal with it, how to respond to it. So I think it's our responsibility to see that, and that should also inspire thinking about the value of the treaty in our context here. So,
let's talk about the current events now. We've had this kind of precursor conversation. All good, and I think it's really important to go over kind of what's been happening, and especially the historical context as well. Thank you, Simon. But just a couple of days ago, the attack that you both referenced within Lebanon, where a range of electronic devices, predominantly pagers, it sounds like, in the first instance, exploded, I think, killing over 30 now across two sets of attacks, wounding 3,000 plus, and a couple of children are among the dead. Doctors and other health workers also among many of the targets. I think something I saw recently was that half the fatalities are health workers and children at the moment. A couple of the next day, more pages exploded at the funerals of people who had died in the initial attack, which is like a war crime on top of a war crime, to be very clear, and just incredibly horrible. And then the next day, a range of other consumer electronics exploded as well. Because and I want to be very clear about that delineation, I guess. These were just normal, mundane, everyday items, pages, laptops, walkie-talkies, and there's this immediate framing that the West is using straight out of the IDF to call these things Hezbollah pages, and has led to this inorganic engagement, bad faith engagement, PR, which is if they're all Hezbollah pages, anyone who had one was a terrorist. And there are several hidden premises there around how you actually get to that conclusion. Clearly bullshit, and you can argue against this forever in terms of whether it was indiscriminate or targeted, the number of civilian casualties, whether it was warranted, the utility of doing this. But none of that really matters insofar as what international law says is a war crime, or what should be morally allowable. What was your initial response to this news coming out, Jeremy, as someone who's kind of done some work in the realm of, would you call it, like, novel weapons or autonomous weaponry?
Yeah, I mean, I was completely appalled, shocked. It takes time to think, to understand the level of depravity that is required to think that to understand that we have a state in the world that thinks that this is a way to behave is just almost unbelievable. And then, of course, to see that it's not going to be condemned by the United States or European countries or our own country. It's just kind of almost ignored, pretend it's not happening. In terms of the technological side of things, if may well have been that this was a shipment of pages that was ordered by Hezbollah in order to avoid what they saw as the insecurity of carrying mobile phones. And I think that there is plenty of evidence that they understand that there have been statements made that show that don't carry a mobile phone, because that's the way in which you'll be identified and targeted. And we know of Israel's other kind of targeting systems, the Gospel and Lavender, that have been written about over the last recent months, which are fed by sources of data which are opaque. We don't know exactly where the data comes from, how they access it, and how the algorithm then works to determine who is a target. I think what's pretty clear is that everybody is potentially a target. The fact that Gaza has been so comprehensively bombed shows that whatever the algorithm is spitting out is what they want to hear, which is that everybody in Gaza is a target. And I think they think the same way about the Lebanese people. I think they think the same about anyone that they can associate with Hezbollah. So, the people of Lebanon, whether they're Palestinian refugees from 1947 who are in the country and have established a political party that represents themselves and represents other people in Lebanon, it's the biggest political party in the country, are entitled to seek their own security and the security of their families. They tried to do that by avoiding what they saw as the main technological danger to them, which was using mobile phones, adopted the use of pages instead of that. And the pages came shipped with explosives inside of them, as far as we know, from some sort of shady operation in Hungary, as far as we can make out, where the parent company seems to have no knowledge as to how this all happened, the company in Taiwan. I think, yeah, everyone needs to be extremely aware of what has happened here and extremely worried about what has happened here. I'm really interested to see what the Taiwanese response is to it. I think Taiwan has, as a close ally of the United States and as a purchaser of weapons from Israel, has considered itself to be a friend, an ally in some sense of Israel. I wonder whether this changes that at all. The fact that they're so willing just to throw a friendly country or the corporation based in the friendly country to the wolves like this. Yeah. Likewise with the next one, the Japanese company that produced the walkie-talkies, which I think has a lot of US military contracts as well, and they're saying it wasn't even their product. So, you would hope that maybe the sort of economic interests at play here might, you mentioned earlier, what are the trigger points for people actually realizing that this is a problem, that people's money is being played with here by the Israelis, like big corporations with big contracts with the US military are suddenly associated with terrorist attack in Lebanon. Is that something that other corporations are going to worry about? I think that there's a whole range of different implications that come out of this, and none of them are good. Like,
Yeah.
this is a bad thing.
There are two threads I kind of want to follow from here. The first is the way it's been covered in the West as being some like ingenious plan, like incredibly creative. Oh, look, the Mossad's at it again, which just seems completely at odds with the reality of what has happened here. And I've seen a few people who are, experts in tech and surveillance and security who are just saying, no, like supply chain attacks have always happened. Like, because this is what this is. This is not a technological attack in the way, their initial thoughts like, oh, have they got some way to hack the phone and make the battery explode? But it's become pretty clear at this point that it's a supply chain attack where explosives were kind of manually put into the items, and then triggered from there. Supply chain attacks have always kind of been part of what militaries get up to. The difference here is lack of respect for international law and the lack of morals. That is the novelty here. And to see Western media and ostensible experts in some places talk about this as as an ingenious spy operation is sickening to watch, and it also elides the reality of what's actually happened here. How do you think, is there a way to flip that to help people realize the actual physical reality of what, and I want to be clear as well, Israel hasn't taken responsibility for this yet. They're keeping their lips tightly sealed on this one. I think they fucking know. But yeah, is there any way to help people realize like the implications of this?
That's again a good question. I think that we are again seeing the depths of the propaganda system that has made us feel like all of this is permissible, and I don't think that that's easily undone. When we've got international law experts, genocide experts around the world, almost universally saying what we're witnessing at the moment is the undoing of international legal regulation, international legal norms, things that we thought were settled for at least since the end of World War II, that have been built up over that time, and that we people were very proud of. International humanitarian law, the Convention on Genocide, even outside of the written laws, just the beliefs that these things are unacceptable, and all of this is being undone at a spectacular rate. And it's worse for the fact that the country that has claimed to be the genesis of this system, the rules-based international order, of human rights, of the promotion of liberal values, is at the center of it, and it's just so comfortable with with seeing this unravel. So I do think in some way it is representative of the unraveling of the United States itself, like the fact that it's so unable, unwilling, uninterested in actually trying to defend any of the principles of international law, to criticize war crimes on this grand scale. This is not new. We know this happened in Korea. We know Vietnam. There's been multiple instances where the United States has been involved in this kind of action, but there's something about now where it feels kind of unrecoverable. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it felt the same way during Vietnam. I don't know, but at the moment it doesn't feel like the United States is capable of recovering its reputation, its importance in sort of standing behind these kinds of principles. And that means, as many experts have noted, that you're not the only ones who are going to do this stuff in the future. If you say that this type of behavior is acceptable, other actors are going to do the same thing. And you won't be in a position to say that you have a problem with it because you haven't said there's a problem with it now.
Yeah, I want to have a chat about that as well, because there's been some really wild reporting and points being made around like, oh no, but what if these enemy countries that haven't done this yet did this now? And you're like,
Yeah.
well, someone's doing it right now. But before we get into that, Ginny, are you able to like kind of discuss the way in which like this is going to be a huge problem for these big corporates and the way that their reputations and like even their financial situation um is gonna be put on the table here.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is not like a direct link to any companies that I deal with at the moment, but like just even
Fortunate.
fortunately, just I'm waiting for someone to be like, and the oil that was used in the tanks to distribute the pages was from BP, and then it's all gonna be,
I
over.
was going to say, very carefully worded, Jenny. The companies right now.
No, the companies that definitely don't endorse any child slavery in the Congo, right now. Um, But no, just in terms of like, I guess how you deal with like a multinational chain like this. So obviously we just talked about the Taiwanese company who was involved in this, which is Gold Apollo. And essentially what companies have been doing for eons and eons and eons and eons is basically putting as many companies between themselves and the material reality of a supply chain line as possible. Like we see this happen all the time with like large fuel companies like BP, with chocolate manufacturers like Mondelez. They want to be as far away from the actual business of the components that they provide and like how those get used in the world. It's so that you can have statistics like Nestle Head Corp has never once contributed to employing child slaves because there is a company in the Congo who is doing that instead. Or you can say, for example, like BP's oil has never been known to cause this amount of pollution because the company that helps BP frack is like a completely third entity. So it's that sort of situation which you see going on here. And so companies have actually always been really good at protecting themselves, I think, from these situations happening. But no company, I would say, at least that I've consulted for, does no company ever really thinks, okay, one day I'm gonna get really, really caught up potentially in a terrorist attack. Like it is not one of the main crisis questions that you get PR training for if you work for, Philip Morris or something. You know what I mean? No one's like, what happens one morning we wake up and we're suddenly implicated in some really, really awful war crime? There are very, very few companies in the world that have that issue. Obviously, like we're talking like the BlackRocks of the world, for example, people that are working on the extreme cutting edge of defense tech probably have those concerns day to day. But most companies that manufacture electronics, pagers, walkie-talkie batteries, walkie-talkie antennas, they don't have this issue. And they're already pretty well insulated by the fact that they only provide certain parts of things. Um, I think this Taiwanese manufacturer who makes the pages, apparently they only actually are responsible for manufacturing or have a patent for only one component of this larger pager. And not like the whole thing. And they also have like another company somewhere in Europe, which is actually the one responsible for organizing all this pager manufacturing, which has paid them a license to use their Apollo Gold branding. And so they haven't actually been, I would say, like there have been no, there may have been completely zero Apollo Gold employees' hands who have touched any of the components that went into making these pages that were detonated. So the company is in a way insulated, and lots of them sort of do these things. But it is very worrying how this, I think, has become an issue of, or it is being discussed as an issue of like national, like a country's compliance or lack of compliance with this international conflict. Like the headlines are now just like Taiwan company or like Taiwan implicated in. And you're like, is that really what you want to go with? Can you say Taiwan and Hungary implicated in, Lebanon terrorist attack when the facts of it are so sparse and these companies have so, I guess, such a tenuous connection to what actually went on? I almost see it as like a way of getting people to stop asking questions about the organizational aspect of the supply chain. Like who actually put these together? Who contaminated the supply chain? It wasn't these companies who make one of 25 million components for these devices. There is another organizing entity, and there has to be one that was actually contaminated and properly infiltrated to make the supply chain attack happen. And like using these broad brushstrokes like, oh, it's Taiwan's implicated, Hungary's implicated, assigning the blame so quickly to countries as entities, I think just deflects and pushes off people from asking further questions about what actually happened in this supply chain attack. So I find that angle of thinking about it like Taiwan's fault, Hungary's fault, very disingenuous.
Yeah, I was trying to think of analogs, right? As far as dangerous products go, because as you say, companies are often able to put themselves at a distance from this stuff. And absurdly, the closest one is like food recalls,
Mm,
where people can just like in some ways it doesn't matter whether or not they had anything to do with the product. If they're making money out of that product and that product is, it might explode, people just aren't going to buy it anymore. And you can do as much PR around that as you want. But as the brushstrokes get broader, whether with intent or not, or just out of fear, people are just less liable to go and buy things from that might have a home in these countries or from these suppliers or be this type of thing. Seen reports coming out of Lebanon from civilians on the ground, and they're just turning off all their electronics. They're just getting them away from their children and out of their homes. People like, is my baby monitor fucking sabotaged? But I think you're right around, it's unhelpful to be saying, oh, how, like, what has Taiwan got to do with this? But at the same time, Taiwan has been brought into it, like, and they have no choice in that matter. And the potential political ramifications of that is something else again.
And economic as well. Like
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how credible they are, but I have seen reports saying that there's already evidence of large scale orders for various electronics being placed with with Chinese companies, which are now seen.
Yeah.
So people are. It feeds it from Israel's point of view. Even it's crazy in the sense that it feeds into the boycott, divestment,
Yeah.
and sanctions approach. Like why would you trust any products that come from this place? There's no reason to. Like there's a reason to be fearful of having dealings with anything linked to Israel following this from an economic point of view. So it's I find it a little odd from that point of view as well, because I think that their economy is suffering, and I think it's going to get far worse, and the potential for internal civil conflict, which many people are obviously openly talking about now within Israel within the next 5 to 10 years, possibly less. Who knows what happens in the next month? Is intensified every time national income drops, and I don't see this as helping in that sense.
Jenny, as far as supply chain hygiene, I guess, or transparency goes, what kind of response can companies have to try and like fix this for themselves? So, like one of the huge issues with capitalism and neoliberalism under the current state and the current system is this obfuscation of who has liability, of where stuff is going, who has touched stuff. There's not much regulation around farming out component parts. all much transparency, shell company upon shell company. Is this the kind of thing where, for example, big consumer electronics companies begin to audit and just say, okay, look, Israel's touched that one, an ally of Israel has touched that one. We cannot have that as part of our supply chain anymore, because of the damage this is going to do to us, on the balance sheet.
Yeah, I mean, we would always recommend an audit. 100% every time you want to go into crisis mode, there should always be an internal audit. But also one thing that is a common tactic to advise when it comes to food companies, consumer goods companies like FMCG, Nestle, all that and stuff. What we would tend to recommend is, and this might sound controversial to most people, but actually really is not. It's just, and a bit hard to apply here because this is a war crime. But normally we go, if you're recalling your chocolate bar because of a bacteria risk, just own up and say, I'm fucking sorry, my chocolate bar has a bacteria risk. We're going to recall it. And then release a TV spot about how great the labs at Nestle are, for creating things, have lots of really squeaky clean imagery around making chocolate bars. It's so hygienic. There are almost no humans in it. It's all just a factory. It's all, chrome and steel and whatnot. And it's fine. No one's coughing on my chocolate bar. No one's spreading COVID through my chocolate bar. Obviously, that sort of dialogue is almost impossible when you have staff involved in an attack on civilians. But what I think you could still do in this situation is sort of, and this has been known to be done before with other electronics companies, you can discontinue the product that was used. You can just say, oh, like I think the Japanese company did this with the walkie-talkies. They were saying, oh, well, that thing that went off, we sold that for a decade between 2000 and 2014. We don't sell that stuff anymore. So whatever was out there, it looks like a model, but it has no warranties on it because obviously it's been tampered with to put these explosives in. So they've gone, obviously there are no authentic seals on it, so we can't verify that it is ours. Someone could have faked it, they could have reproduced it. We haven't exported as our company directly to that region of the world for more than 10 years. So ergo, not our responsibility. So if I were Apollo Gold, I'll be wanting to run the exact same line because they themselves as a company do not export products directly to that part of the world. So if I'm them, I'm going, that's awful. That's a tragedy. Really so sorry. Hate that someone has co-opted my beautiful pager design and components to make such an awful thing happen across the world. But we at this company are committed to future safety of employees, anyone who uses our pages. And, we can't control what happens once we release plans into the world, but at least here in Taiwan, we can guarantee safety first, people first, and do a TV spot with a happy family, No funerals, no nothing. Thanks, Dad, the pager got me home on time for dinner. That sort of situation. So sounds awful and jaded because it really is just obfuscation and sort of pushing the blame onto somebody else. But there isn't much else that you can do as an electronics company when you're implicated in a attack in an event of this size. You can't just go, oh, I'm so sorry about the pager attack, but business as usual. Something visible has to happen. So if it hasn't been discontinued already, it should be discontinued, and they should do what ISOS, the Japanese company, did, and just really separate themselves from the whole export process, put themselves as far away from Lebanon as possible in both marketing, in both rhetoric, and also in product.
It's very hard to see them survive, like that brand surviving in any.
100%.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Yeah. Like you wouldn't go and buy their product now, right?
No.
Like, who would buy their product?
Yeah.
Yeah. Back to the war crimes itself, and the implications of what this means. Like this is, we've seen 12 months almost of what I just called red lines. What a meaningless term, at this point, being crossed. And this is the other thread I wanted to pick up, and you mentioned it as well, Jeremy, the way in which Western media, and some Western spokespeople have immediately jumped to, oh no, Putin could do this to us now. Or like, oh no, China is a huge manufacturer of electronics. Now, like, what if they did this? As one which I'm seeing coming out of the US quite a lot. Like, oh, this is why we need to put a ban on Chinese goods. Look, neither of those countries have actually done this. But there's this projection onto, our civilizational enemies as being the real risk of this kind of attack, as opposed to this Western ally that has overwhelming support from the hegemony, that has done this on three separate occasions within 2 or 3 days.
Well, it's the dehumanization. It's a point that's been made so many times before, but that's what's at play here, is that whether you're a Palestinian or a Lebanese, whatever, it's not viewed as having any value to your life, and that's from the Western media and political perspective, and that's been the reality for a long time. So an inability to empathize with those people as humans. And, that's the purpose of the narrative, and that's the purpose of the narrative control and of the intimidation, and all of that stuff is tied to maintaining that that these people aren't worthy of your sympathy. They're not actually people on the same level as you. And we're all familiar with that as a part of the history of dispossession, genocide. That's essential to those processes, and that's really what's at play here. So yeah, exactly. It's like this will matter if it happens to real people. So maybe that's why we should be critical of it.
Yeah, it feels so nasty. But at the same time, like that is the implication,
Yeah.
If the only thing stopping a state military or a state actor making a supply chain attack of this magnitude, and I think it's been noted that is with like a 6 month cooldown. So like all the arguments around it being like a discriminate attack or like only targeting XYZ, even if, there had been a Hezbollah order, which seems like that is the case, if the intervention in the supply chain happened that long ago, there is absolutely no way for the IDF or whoever has done this to have clarity around where those bombs are. And that's being ignored an awful lot and very conveniently. But the fact that it's killed, a bunch of civilians who normally use this kind of technology, like doctors use pages all over the place because it's a much easier way to get around the hospital than having someone call you on your cell phone all the time, like is another factor in it being a war crime. There is no discrimination here. They didn't give a shit.
Yeah, it's simply not possible for them to have known where those devices were and who was carrying them, and even aside from all of that, as you say, even if they were all being carried only by Hezbollah leadership or soldiers, it's still a war crime because those people are not engaged in combat at that time.
Yeah.
So it's this isn't even in doubt. Like it's crazy that people would even try to muddy the water around that. This is it doesn't seem to be a limit on what people are willing to excuse, to overlook, to even praise and joke about. Like that's been one of the more shocking aspects of this, is kind of, hey, jokey reception from all the people who'd been demanding unqualified sympathy for the victims of the October 7 attacks by Hamas around Gaza, and attacking and harassing and getting people sacked and all kinds of things for even vaguely sort of discussing why Hamas might have carried out that attack, the history that it was a part of, let alone actually making jokes about it.
Yeah.
And like having pictures and videos of the victims with like meme jokes and stuff like that. Like it's a really depraved response that we're seeing primarily from the main sort of outlets that have been, promoting the cause of Israel over the past 11 months, but it goes beyond that as well, and it really feeds that anti-Islamic, anti-Arab sentiment in the West, and it feeds off that. It's very, very worrying.
We've got our own little nasty cottage industry of that here in New Zealand on social media as well. And it's just been really shocking to see, some of these people are platformed on mainstream media with reasonable frequency, very intentionally ignoring, the civilians that were killed, making jokes about pages. And they know what the reality of this is. Like these are people who are plugged into the implications of what they're saying. But it's people are calling it vice signaling. Like this is the part of the ritual self-identification, the humiliation of the other, showing that you're on the in group around this particular issue is to mark yourself in a way that maybe doesn't make you acceptable in polite society in some regard, but definitely gets you invited to drinks with a particular cohort, to have a big old laugh about this stuff elsewhere. And it's coming alongside these like diatribes, and these really like big debate me energy screeds, around the utility of this. Oh, but this is war, kind of framing, which we've heard in Gaza like constantly. Like there's some collateral damage, and that's just how it happens. And like you're not being serious if you don't just accept that as the reality. Oh, like these are bad guys, and some good guy's going to get hurt. But if the bad guys just stop being bad, then there wouldn't be any problem. And it's all very clearly incorrect. And also, it doesn't even matter if they're, as you say, it doesn't matter if they are correct about that. It's still a war crime. There are rules about this stuff because of the chaos that occurs if there aren't. And I think, even though it's clearly aligned with the dehumanization of Arab peoples, and Lebanese and Palestinians in particular, the worries from Western leaders and media about this, oh, it could happen to us. You're absolutely correct. You have okayed this kind of behavior by a state actor. Wow, big fuck up, guys. Like, and especially because, in this case, it's very clear who the actor is. That doesn't have to be the case. I'm incredibly surprised that we haven't seen a shutdown of flights, or immediate extra security concerns. I think Qatar Airways is an airline that has taken immediate action on that. Like you can't bring like small electronics onto our planes.
I think that was a Lebanese civil aviation directive that these electronics couldn't be brought on flights, and then, yeah, so it would apply to everyone in that. But yeah, I saw the Qatar Airways one in particular. But yeah, in terms of that, it could happen to us. I've been reading the Paul Lynch novel Prophet Song. I don't know, it won the Booker Prize last year. It's speculative fiction about, I would say, a near future fascism having risen in Ireland, and a war that breaks out or in response to that. So a rebellion against the rise of a fascist regime in Ireland. And I've reached a point in that where I haven't been able to complete it. And anyone who's read the book probably knows where that point is toward the end of the book. It just gets to such a grim and dark place. So in a sense, I think the thinking about, it could happen to us is useful. Like it's important for us. It's maybe a part of a process of trying to empathize, to think, well, that's what these people are going through, kids being killed and tortured, and actually everyone just kind of going along with it. And yeah, so I do think there is some value in having that, in projecting it onto other cases, making analogies to other situations.
What do you see as being the future of the conflict? I know that prediction in the social sciences is such a fraught thing, but to my mind at least, there are really only two ways, and they're not necessarily not interlinked, like the implosion of Israel and also, something akin to the Samson option. But I wonder, it seems like it's on its death throes, but I wonder what your analysis is of where Israel can possibly go from here.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. And again, this is a question that comes up a lot in my classes, as students are like, what do you think happens next? And I can only say that I don't know, but the course that we're on at the moment looks like we're headed for a major war of some description. It's hard to see how much longer Iran will be willing to be humiliated in the way that it has been with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, and just with the general rhetoric, I think, around this conflict. And so we'll see I think the Lebanese people and government are preparing for a large-scale air bombardment at least, and probably some kind of attempted ground invasion from the south. That seems to be what the Israelis are preparing for. Whether other regional actors, Iran, Iraq, I don't know if Syria has any capacity to engage with this at all. I don't know what Egypt's reaction would be. I wonder what the reaction of the Gulf states would be, because I would suspect that their populations are wildly in favor of taking a harder line against Israel, but their regimes that are in place in those countries are obviously not in that place because they're so dependent on the support of the US. So how that manifests is really hard to see. But you look at those large populous countries in that region, and you look at how small territorially and population-wise Israel is amongst that. And I know that they can refer back to the history of 1967 and 1973 and be like, well, we've taken on these armies before.
Yeah,
I don't think it's the same proposition today at all. And I think that the patience of others in the region, Turkey and others, is probably worn thin, and of their publics. And so yeah, I think they're facing a very different world now than they were in previous wars and previous decades, and really chancing their arm by pushing it in the way that they are right now, obviously in the hope that the United States comes to their rescue if anything goes wrong, or also, well, we've got nuclear weapons and we're mad enough to use them. And I believe that that's true. and that's a real worry. Where does that lead us? Who knows?
There's this really
It's not
frustrating there's this really frustrating narrative that just keeps getting trotted out, like, we're calling on, Iran and Turkey and etc. To do everything they can to de-escalate.
Yeah, show
Um,
restraint.
yeah,
Oh,
show
why?
restraint. And like, no,
They're not.
they are. They are
Yeah.
really, really heavily, actually.
Yeah.
And alongside that, this right to self-defense that always gets trotted out for Israel, and it's just not applied to Lebanon. Lebanon was bombed this morning in Beirut, and Israel was just able to say, "Oh, it's a targeted attack, so it's fine." And everyone's like, "Oh, yeah, targeted attack." Okay, but we know that this isn't real. This is purely PR. The targeted attacks just kill civilians everywhere. And it doesn't even matter if it is a targeted attack. It's a bombing on a sovereign nation. This is an act of war and or a war crime. And why are the other states always the ones expected to show restraint here, other than the fact that the US has a couple of aircraft carriers parked nearby? You kind of alluded to it as well, but this constant, like, Iran-backed Hezbollah, Iran-backed Hamas or whatever. Robert Wood, who's the deputy UN envoy for the US, this morning was saying, going into these right to defend kind of arguments, and then completely without a hint of irony, heading out at Iran, saying that through its sustained supply of weapons and personnel to Hezbollah, Iran appears to have a different agenda. And you're like, who's supplying Israel? It's a very clear and very explicit at this point set of double standards.
Yeah.
One person can stop this war, like, genuinely. Well, one person, one actor, and that's the United States.
And you mentioned you asked about the technology before, and the technology plays a really important role in the narrative, even if not in the reality. Like, bombing is bombing regardless of how much technology is built into the bomb. But it plays a really important part in retaining that idea. Oh, we're the precise military, we're the moral military. We only hit targets which is a nonsense, because everybody's on the target list, right? Everyone's somehow, you've seen it. Children who weren't even born on October 7 are considered to be legitimate targets from this point of view, from the point of view of their algorithms. It's the technology provides a cover. It's a way of reinforcing that their sense of self, but also the sense of self that they project, their identity that they project to the world, the high tech, the startup nation. It's a load of nonsense, obviously, but technology gives the veneer of being in conformity with the good. And yeah, we need to really be aware of how that functions as well.
All right. Well, I think we might wrap it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeremy.
Well, it's always, as I said at the start, maybe not a pleasure, but it's nice to be able to get these. I've been finding recently that when I'm not in class, like when I'm not speaking to the class, when I'm not talking about these things, that's when I get most tense about it. So it's actually nice to be able to just unload a bit.
Absolutely agreed. Where can people find you if they want to engage with you online or otherwise?
As I said last time, I
Don't
am on
find him.
X. Yeah, you can find me on X, or I'm you can look me up on at the University of Canterbury, but or on here. That's probably about it.
Fantastic. Simon, do you want to give your plugs?
Yeah, I guess this is it, eh, Kyle? You made me read some material for no reason.
Yeah,
Why was
sorry.
I brought on? It's okay. Yeah, you can find no, actually, anybody who's listening to this is a person who has sort of probably some sort of scruples and pearls to clutch, and therefore I don't want to give away my ideas on this one because my Twitter is not related to international relations or really reasoning at all. It's mostly things that you wouldn't want your mother to see. So
All right. And Ginny, where can people find you?
I'm Eggs for Dogs on all available social media. I don't tweet about supply chains or my job very much, but you can read my tweets at work, so parents would be okay with reading them. The opposite to Simon's timeline.
Fantastic. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us again. Thank you to our audience. As I said at the beginning, we'll have a hiatus of an indefinite amount of time coming up once we hit 100 episodes. For our current events programming, we'll continue producing content and doing a range of other things during that time. And if you want to help support that, if you want to help grow independent left media in New Zealand, there is a Patreon link in the summary. Subscribe, help us out. We need like so much more money than we currently have in this space. We do like to share the resource as well, help other organizations get their feet under them. The right wing has millions and millions and millions of dollars and get paid to be incompetent, which I mean is fantastic in some ways, but I would love even a percentage of that resource to make good stuff instead. Give us a hand, or just share this around and get more people involved. We need everyone we can get to be having these inflection points, to be having these conversations where they start to speak out, where they start to get engaged, and put more pressure on leadership in whatever way they choose to do that. That's been another week of 1 of 200. We'll catch you next time.
If artifices are then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paved with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they quote this as a cost we ought to stay. I live amongst the people every day in this vindictive, forgetful fucking rain. It feels like we're